Good morning, everyone. My name is William Tan. I am a junior at the college studying government and psychology, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to the Future Political Analyst panel, featuring some of the most exciting new voices in political analytics. Our first panelist is Gabe Fleisher, the author of Wake Up to Politics, one of the most widely read political newsletters on Substack, reaching more than 60,000 readers across all 50 states. We also have Armin Thomas, partner and analyst at Split Ticket, a nonpartisan organization whose goal is to present electoral data compellingly through data analysis and political forecasting. We also have Rachel Janfaza, who is a Harvard graduate and also the founder of The Up and Up, a qualitative research, media, and strategy firm focusing on understanding youth political culture, movements, and all things Gen Z politics. And finally, we're rounded out in our speakers by Logan Phillips, who founded The Race to the White House, a political news site focusing on election forecasting and polling, with posts and articles circulated to up to 7 million page views in the last election cycle. Our panel will be moderated by Steve Kornaki. Mr. Kornaki is a national political correspondent for NBC News and is a very, very experienced journalist, writer, and political analyst. Please give him a warm round of applause.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And it's good to be with the panel. I realized listening to that, so the future political analysts are here, and I think that makes me the past. So it's this is a new role for me. I see how that works. Won't take it personally. But maybe we'll start on that, actually, because I am kind of curious, and I was thinking about looking at the work you guys do and thinking back to sort of how I got started and what the media political atmosphere was like. It was a while ago. But it made me sort of wonder. I can think back to a few different kind of people and sort of, media outlets, shows, newspapers, magazines, things that when I was, sort of coming of age that I read, that I consumed, that really kind of got me interested in politics and kind of put me on this path. And I can remember what that atmosphere was like in the 1990s. I'm curious what it was like for you, so maybe I'll start with you, Gabe. And I want to tell everybody there's a second reason I want to start with Gabe. It's not just that he's the first one in the row here. It's that I think the most formative experience in Gabe's life, I'll speak from here, was when he was about 12 years old, and a little low-rated weekend show on MSNBC called Up with Steve Kornaki called him because he was already a pundit at 12 years old in St. Louis, Missouri. We put him on the air. He came on our show. We actually did a sort of a fake, news of the week game show as part of this, and we put him up there. And this is what I always remember about Gabe. We had meetings before we put him on, because we put him on with a real pundit to go toe-to-toe in this game. And we were sort of like, let's kind of make sure Gabe looks okay here. He didn't need any lowering of the bar. He beat the pundit outright. So anyway, Gabe, it's nice to see you again. And I'm curious, besides that, kind of how you got your start.
It's good to see you, Steve. And I always appreciate it. It was so kind of you to put me on. That was my very, very first kind of big media opportunity, and it meant so much to me at the time. And I think, if you're asking about people in media that I think meant a lot to our generation, I think you are one of them. And I think if you ask any of the election nerds kind of in the room, I think there's a lot of people here who you are one of those people. I think for me, I think I wouldn't say necessarily so representative of like Gen Z as a whole. I started my newsletter pretty young, at 9 years old, and I read a lot of just morning political newsletters. Is kind of how I got started. I was reading Mike Allen's Playbook and reading a lot of morning newsletters like that. I'd say that was kind of my earliest start. The newsletter at the beginning was called The Daily Rundown, after another short-lived show, Chuck Todd's show on MSNBC. He generously let me steal the name, but and then I changed it to Wake Up to Politics when I realized that might not be legal. But so I'd say, I think there was a lot of different influences and kind of big names that I think really influenced me early on.
For me, I think I've always been, adjacent to politics. I grew up in a very politics, in a household with, my mom and dad would always talk about politics. My earliest memory was when I was 5, so this is dating myself. This was in 2004. And this was in 2004, and it was in November. And I grew up here in Massachusetts, and so my mom took us to the airport at Hanscom to see John Kerry get off the plane. And I distinctly remember seeing John Kerry, and John Kerry's wife, Teresa, actually like cuddled my sister or something, who was 2 at the time. It was nice. Needless to say, my mom thought that she had the kiss of death because anybody that, she would go see or visit, whatever, turned out to lose. She was not happy about that. And then after that, I remember 2008, we watched the election night, and that was where I erroneously thought that, usually by 11 o'clock, that day, we'd figure out who won the election. Not the case. In 2012 as well, and then it was really 2016 when, I became old enough to, kind of really understand what was going on in politics that I took an interest. And then when I went to college, I majored in statistics and data science, and so that kind of got me down the rabbit hole of, following, all of these different electoral, data points and, understanding why people and voters make the decisions that they do. And then it was, during COVID that I got into, the Twitter subculture that is called election Twitter, and there's a community of people out there that, are dedicated to map making and data analysis and all. And, I met Leon and Isaac, who are in the audience over there as well. And, Split Ticket was founded that way. So, it's kind of a long, circuitous path, but that's kind of how it is.
I asked the question to torture myself when you say you were 5 in 2004. Go ahead, Rachel.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you for having us here today. My early political memories were during the Obama-Romney election, and I think seeing sort of like the classroom vote that we had then. But certainly the 2016 election was the most formative political experience for not just myself, but I think for many in Gen Z and the country, obviously, at large. And when I think about the media environment and the outlets that I was looking towards, certainly Axios. I remember, so my 4 years of college were the 4 years of Trump's first term, and there was like a Axios campus ambassador program that I was a part of, so that was formative. I also, my secondaries was women, gender, and sexuality studies, and I was obsessed with the evolution of women's fashion magazines to cover politics during the rise of women candidates in the 2018 midterms. That was massively formative. But what I think back to is that we're the Gen Zers of us on this panel, we're sort of in the oldest cusp of Gen Z, and I talk a lot about how there are 2 Gen Zs. And so when you think about the media environment that our generation has come up in, there is a massively different environment for the older cusp as compared to the younger cusp of this generation. And it's really crazy the speed at which the ecosystem is changing has made it so that even for our generation, there are so many different voices and outlets and now individual creators who resonate with individual people.
Hi, first of all, great to be here with you guys, especially with these guys who are all really talented and doing great work, and also with the political explainer-in-chief, Steve Kornaki. So I got into politics originally because I wanted to make a difference. Both my parents grew up below the poverty line, and they were able to do well, and so there's not nearly as many people that go from the bottom to the top these days, right? So I wanted to do as much good as I possibly could, and so that's kind of why I chose that world. The last thing I ever thought I would get into was political data journalism, but I loved reading 538. I loved the work that J. Elliott Morris had done on The Economist, and I just kept reading in, breathing in, and really helped me understand things because, you can't really understand the larger American people if you're living in one place, even in your place like where I went to undergrad, Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, where it's like rural red, very different than the suburban town I grew up in Connecticut, because there's just so many different types of Americans, right? So the data side is so valuable, as in that you don't have to be talking to everyone to have an idea of where things are going to go. It's not everything, but it'll bring you a lot further. And so in grad school, I wanted to move to international affairs because America is the most powerful country in the world. It has a huge impact on the global stage. But I couldn't really escape politics. I had a class on presidential campaign management during my master's at Columbia and with Karine Jean-Pierre, and we had to create fake campaign plans for the primary. Mine was for Joe Biden. And given how much I'd gotten used to the numbers, this is back in 2019, early on, no one was doing polling averages for the primary. And I kind of figured, you know what, I can figure this out. And it was way easier than I thought. Early on, Nate Silver used to say more of his process. Like when he was on the New York Times, I found some old articles, kind of made it my own. And then I just kept building different pieces, piece by piece, for each state to figure out who the demographic threats were for Biden in terms of which groups he was going with. Pete Buttigieg was like the easy, clear challenge for him in Iowa, New Hampshire, even back then. And I was going to just leave it there. I decided for fun to reboot it right before the primaries, and it did better than the forecasts that were out there publicly. And then I was really going to leave it there because I had one semester left in grad school and I was loving it. I needed to get back to my life. But then the pandemic hit and New York City went completely silent. It became brutally boring to be living in there instead of amazing. And so I had all this free time during my last semester, and my friends convinced me I should give it a shot and put all this stuff I was doing online. And little by little, I was able to build an audience, and now it's how I got into running Race to the White House.
All right. So I also think it'd be interesting just to hear about some of the work you're doing right now. You each have kind of found a very specific area. I think you're kind of hearing it in these stories. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you're doing, how you think about the audience that you have for what you're doing, and what the work is, what you're finding in your work. I'm curious, Logan, starting with you, you're talking about curating polls, doing forecasts, as you say, something you would picked up on looking at 538 and other sites. How do you look at that work right now? This whole question of what's the future of polling? Is polling reliable? I mean, a forecast based on polling is only going to be as good as the polls that go into it. So I'm curious how you approach that and how you think about your audience.
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. So I would say my overall approach is I try to make politics as easy to understand so that anyone that's following it this much will be able to get it, right? So a huge part of my audience is going to come through Google searches. And so I want someone to, within 2 or 3 minutes, have a clear idea of the chance each party has of winning the election, what the major races are. So the people that are looking, just because maybe they want to volunteer, they want to donate, they want to get involved, I can help give that information to them, right? Because a lot of people are donating to candidates that are in safe races that are exciting, but it's not going to make much of a difference. And, people have a lot of spare money a lot of the time. They're working hard, and the little money they have that they're willing to donate, for these middle class, small dollar donors, to go to the places where it matters the most. So that's always front and center in how I design things. And so, yeah, I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. That comes with every single election forecaster, right? But I think the basic premise is if I can help my viewers have an understanding of what the political cycle looks like, I consider that a success.
So Rachel, you just talked about this a little bit a minute ago. I'm curious to hear a little bit more, though, because I'm curious what your audience is as you see it, because this question of Gen Z, going right, gender divide, I think everybody is interested in that right now who's interested in politics. So I'm curious what you think about in terms of your audience. And if you could just talk a little bit more, what you said about the 2 Gen Zs and what you're finding there, just to describe that to folks a little bit.
Yes, of course. Thank you. So just to give a little overview of what I do, I run the Up and Up, which is a media and qualitative research firm, purely qualitics. I don't do any of the numbers like you guys, where we hold listening sessions with groups of young people across the country. And to back up, I started as a political journalist. I was at CNN on their digital politics team, mostly covering young voters. And I started to travel to Republican districts, mostly ahead of the 2022 midterms. And that was really what sparked my interest in talking with young people specifically, because I had written my thesis here on the role of social media in youth-led social movements from 2010 to 2020, which was outdated the moment I turned it in right before the pandemic when we were sent home in 2020. But I had been obsessed with youth culture and just saw the way that culture was really integral to the way that young people were understanding and participating in politics. So this inspired me to start a Substack in 2022 called The Up and Up, which has turned into the firm that I described. And on a regular basis, we are holding listening sessions with our Gen Z community across the country. We have ambassadors, not just on campuses. There are a lot of students who are involved in this, but it's also early career professionals and young people who are just want a space to talk. I think so much of our political conversation talks about young people, but not with young people, and doesn't give them a space to share their concerns. So I call these listening sessions because they're not really, it is essentially a focus group, but I just sit there and listen. I ask questions and I give them the space to share. And one of the earliest findings that we had at the Up and Up was that there is a stark difference in how the older members of Gen Z and the younger members of Gen Z are thinking about not just politics, but the world. And there are two major factors that I believe play into this, and there has been quantitative research to back this up since then. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that it really bifurcated this generation. So the way I did the cutoff with Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0 is anyone who had graduated high school before the start of the pandemic is considered Gen Z 1.0, and anyone who was still in high school, even if they were graduating in 2020 and younger, I consider part of Gen Z 2.0. So you can imagine if you're a young person and you're in high school during the pandemic, you basically have your childhood, or even if you're in middle school or elementary school, you have elements of your childhood and adolescence kind of feeling like they're ripped away from you. You might take an anti-authority posture. You might be frustrated at the adults in the room who were in charge of the school protocols, the mask mandates, the COVID vaccine. And I think this is in part why we see a shift to the right amongst the younger members of Gen Z. The other thing is the media environment, and I talked a little bit about that before, but the biggest change is TikTok. And when I was in high school and college, TikTok wasn't a thing. But if you're in college now, it is the primary social media platform. And it has really changed the way that young people not just consume information, but the way that they talk, the way that they think, the clothes that are trendy, the songs that are popular, the artists that resonate, and also politics. And it just so happens that the pace is really quick, super unfiltered. It's, more authentic, so to speak. And those are qualities that young people see reflected in President Donald Trump. So that is a bit there. There's also a massive gender gap, as Steve has researched extensively and shared a bit in his question. And the social media algorithms feed very different content to young men and young women, and that shapes the environment in which we've grown up in as well. So I'll pause there. I could go on forever.
And Armin, we say, Gen Z is a big question to folks nationally. Another huge one is the Hispanic vote, the shift rightward in 2024 under Donald Trump. I know it's something you've looked extensively at, and I think also in particular you've looked in the Southwest, South Texas, which obviously is going to be big in the congressional races next year. I'm curious, sort of talk about your work in there, what you're finding, and again, curious too, just about sort of your audience.
Yeah, so this is actually, very interesting because, right before what I'm doing currently, I'm actually an MBA student at Duke. I flew, here last night. Before that, I was actually a teacher with Teach for America in South Texas. So I got to see, firsthand, up close, what realignment looks like, in real life. And what you're saying about Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0 is so spot on. It's actually crazy. Like, I was at a high school, right? I was at Harlingen High School, and I was a math teacher. And, I definitely probably made some mistakes, first year teacher. But, the way that obviously it wasn't political, but you could definitely tell that, the male students and the female students were basically living in two very, very different, media atmospheres. And just in terms of, the various things that they said and how they acted and all of that, and you could definitely tell it was TikTok, right? Because, they're always on their phones and all that. But in terms of, why has the Latino vote shifted so much? I mean, I think there's a lot that could be said. I don't want to go on for too long, but I want to reject the idea that this was bound to happen, right? Because whenever people talk about these gigantic political shifts that come out of nowhere, we retroactively justify them by saying that the choices that we as a party take, were always going to be made, and, no matter what, these voters were going to move away from us because we were not going to abandon some things that we hold dear. No, everything in politics is a choice if you think about it enough. And so the various different choices about what it is to prioritize, in terms of the different coalition groups that make up the Democratic Party, were, I think, alienating to a lot of Latino voters in a way that Donald Trump and, the new media that he's really good at using were very, very, Donald Trump's people were very adept at exploiting that and getting that message out. So obviously the biggest example is immigration, right? In 2016, Donald Trump makes headlines, says that Mexicans are rapists and some are good people, right? That's what he said. And he did pretty badly with the Latino vote, right? Not as badly as Obama did, but he still did pretty badly. And in 2018, the general thesis of the Democratic coalition was that, it was a lot of, the demographics is destiny, rainbow coalition of minorities, plus, a large enough minority of white voters that is liberal and, committed to, what can broadly be termed as anti-racist thought. And that mostly holds up, right? And then in 2020, you see this massive shift in the Latino vote. And, why that is, some of it obviously is ideological polarization. Some of it I think was triggered by COVID. Some of it was triggered by a lack of in-person campaigning in minority communities. But then when you look at the Biden presidency and you look at how immigration was approached, a lot of the impulse in terms of the people who were staffing the Biden White House, were very, ideologically driven, left-wing, Warrenite people. And the base impulse is to say, let's just undo everything that Donald Trump did, right? And, you can agree, you can disagree with Donald Trump's immigration policy, right? Most people didn't necessarily support, a lot of the restrictions that they did. But the result of the Biden immigration policies was that the border was legitimately a lot more permissive in terms of letting people cross. And, when people in the Democratic coalition who are the media class, talk about immigration, it's usually from an attitude of, this country has room for everybody, we have to let all the people in who want to come in, right? And that's, a humanitarian message. But, the Latino people on the border, who have been voting Democratic, longer than black voters have, had the right to vote in the Democratic coalition, these are very working class, blue collar, poor people. And these communities are the ones that have to shoulder the actual economic burden of having all of these people come, and especially with the internet, with TikTok and all, and just the ease of getting to places to claim asylum, right? You're going to see a large glut. And so what you see in places like the Valley was that, everybody was saying, there's too much, the Democrats that we've supported, they're leaving us behind, they're abandoning us, and they clearly care more about other people than us. That's why that ad, in 2024 that Donald Trump said about Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you, yes, it obviously has transphobic undertones, but they, them refers to any particular group that you as an individual voter feel is getting a better deal than you that you think, does not deserve that. And then obviously you have, the more, traditional attitudes on gender, on, sexuality, on abortion, on all of those things that, in the wake of Dobbs and all of that, Democrats have adopted a more hard line on. And so naturally in 2024, you could really tell that the Republicans were trying to win the Hispanic vote. And especially in Texas, where it's a Republican state, the local, political machines are going to be more inclined to play ball with, Republican players in a Republican state. That's kind of how you engineered a lot of those shifts. And I think it's going to stick too, because a lot of Donald Trump's, he's reversed a lot of his approvals with Latino voters now. But you kind of saw a similar story with working class whites in 2018 after he did much better with them in 2016, where, he did worse, but at the same time, he still held on to most of his gains, right? Like, there were districts like, Richard Ojeda in West Virginia's 3rd district, right? That voted for Donald Trump by 50 points. And, Ojeda overperformed significantly, but he still lost by 13 instead of 50, right? Whereas if that election was held in 2012, Ojeda might have won the race, right? So I think with Latino voters, you're going to see a good amount of reversion because, many of these voters are new voters. They're not as ideologically hardened. They don't have the same, convictions about what's left and right as much. But, that'll harden over time. And, I think that, the 80% margins that Democrats used to get in the Valley are probably not, the conditions that sustain those are no longer in place. So I think, that was a long-winded answer, but I think, there's a lot that's going into it. But, politics is downstream of the choices that people make and the situations that, lead people to vote the way they do. And I think that the Latino community is just in a different place now than it was, 10 or 20 years ago.
All right. And Gabe, so we mentioned, wake up to politics. You started this Well, how old were you when you started it?
9 years old.
Okay, so take us from 9-year-old Gabe starting Wake Up Politics to today. You still do it. How have you built it? Who are you talking to with it? What's the mission?
Yeah, well, hopefully it's evolved a little bit since I was on your show since the very beginning. The mission of the newsletter is really just to make politics accessible, kind of to anyone who wants to know more about their kind of civic process. Kind of a big focus on kind of breaking down kind of processes and systems that kind of undergird our politics that maybe people learned about in civics class, but have maybe forgotten about. Talking what is the reconciliation process, what is the nuclear option, trying to kind of look at things from a more granular level. A big focus on every week, every Friday in my newsletter, I kind of look at, what are the bills that have passed Congress this week, not just, the one big beautiful bill or things like that, but, what are the very granular, bipartisan pieces of legislation that, large media outlets might not be paying attention to, but, might be, giving benefits to, a couple tens of thousands of veterans or things like that, that are kind of making small changes, but important changes to our society, but getting almost no coverage. That's a big focus of my newsletter. And just kind of looking, we're covering the one big beautiful bill. I did a series recently, a 6-part series, kind of reader's guide of the one big beautiful bill, not just giving a summary of it, but kind of going section by section and trying to teaching people not just what was in it, but kind of how to read a piece of legislation that large, trying to give people the tools to try to understand legislation. So I'd say the audience, it's something I'm proud of. It's pretty diverse. I think I write with, I think someone in my, I think I write to make sure that young people can read it and kind of understand it, even people who don't follow politics pretty closely. But, what I've been kind of interested to find, there are people who read the newsletter who are, members of Congress and their staffs and White House officials and, people all across, news executives and journalists. And I think it's interesting. I think that, that kind of formula of just trying to make politics accessible, whether it's, for people, teachers who's in a high school classroom, can also be helpful to people even who work in politics for a long time, but can need some of those refreshers or need, you might specialize in one area of policy and can be helpful to be refreshed in something else. So it's a pretty broad audience. It's anchored now on Substack, which I think has been I've been doing it in the newsletter 11 years now, but on Substack just over a year right after I graduated. Moved into Substack onto independent media, which has been really great, and I think great opportunity to reach. Again, a really broad and diverse audience. It's been interesting to see. I mean, Rachel's on Substack too, and now Split Tickets on Substack. Obviously, Logan's in independent media too, you'd say, right? And I think that is a place a lot of young people are kind of congregating at this point. I think a lot of the skepticism that I think Jeffrey was talking about the last panel about towards institutions, and I think a lot of journalists cover that all the time. Skepticism towards who's ever in the White House, whoever's controlling Congress, towards the courts. I don't think journalists always realize also applies to media institutions in a really big way too. And so it's been, I think, really cool to kind of graduate and go straight into independent media, which obviously not just on Substack and even more so on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, is I think increasingly the place where young people are kind of gravitating towards to get information.
Can you just talk about maybe just the future with the future analysts here, the next few years? Most immediately we got elections coming up next month, November, New Jersey, Virginia. We'll have midterms next year, presidential. I'm curious what each one of you are sort of looking at, whether it's to do with elections in particular, whether it's to do with the media industry, the sort of the world you work in, the political industry, if you want to call it that. Are there particular trends you're looking at over the next couple of years you think we might get some answers to, some clarity on that you're particularly curious about?
Yeah, this one's a little more short-term, I would say, but I think you're starting to see a lot more competitive Democratic primaries. Which is kind of interesting, right? It's been heavily dominated by the Republican side. And there's a school of thought that to some degree that's why Democrats are overperforming in a lot of these Senate races because, the party chooses someone who seems like the best candidate on paper, and the Republicans have a tough fight where they're doing ads against each other consistently. And they kind of start from a stronger place. We're seeing now in Michigan, in Texas, in Iowa, and in Maine, especially if Governor Mills ends up running, which seems likely as of late. And that's kind of fun for my job and makes it a little tougher because one of the things that I try to do is predict what's going to happen in the primaries. I run primary forecasts, sometimes publicly, sometimes internally. And then I run up to 50 different variations of the Senate race based off every potential matchup that could happen. So I got a little more work on my hands in the weeks and months to come as a result. But I think it kind of makes it interesting, right? And I think for Democratic primary voters, there's sort of a positive and negative, because the good thing about the American political system is it empowers people that aren't elites to have more of a say in who their nominees are, and certainly more than it was historically. The downside is it means that the center has much less of a say in a way, especially in these safe races, because the people that end up winning these usually represent the more extremes of the party. But I still think that in some cases it could potentially lead to better candidates. In Michigan, Haley Stevens seemed like the favored candidate of some of the more elites in the Democratic Party, but there's a good argument that she wound up being the best candidate, especially if being able to connect and be authentic is what's really going to matter to some of the younger voters in Michigan that swung to Trump, and that Democrats need to swing back for them to be able to take the seat.
Rachel?
So I'm always thinking about the future, and I didn't really answer the question on audience. I apologize. I have the Gen Z community, which are young people across the country, but the audience of the newsletter is really anyone who wants to understand what those Gen Zers are thinking. And the trends that I'm currently focused on and trying to distill that come out of the listening sessions are the economy as the number one issue for young people, which I think for a long time was overlooked, despite the fact that poll after poll after poll showed that it was the number one issue. This is turned into a desire for economic populist messaging, not so different from what we see with older voters. I think that's one big misconception about young voters, is that they're massively different from the rest of the population, and it's just not true. So I'm looking specifically at the New York mayoral race. I think there are a lot of similarities that can be drawn between Zohran Mamdani's campaign and the campaign that Trump ran in 2024. And part of the reason why both of these campaigns are appealing to young people, and young men in particular, perhaps, is because of the economic populist messaging that is talking about the cost of living and just how expensive it is. Like, the number one thing on Zohran Mamdani's website before the primary was living in New York City is too expensive. And he said he's going to fix that. And the reality is that that's kind of the only thing that young people want to hear. And their views are nuanced, but they're trying to get through the day-to-day life. And that matters, especially as the conversation about what AI is doing to the job market is something that is like so top of mind in every conversation I have. So that is one of the trends I'm looking at. I just wrote yesterday about how and why the Maha movement is resonating with young men in particular as well. I know there's been a lot of obsession with young men, especially looking at this gender gap and the fact that in Circle's early data, we saw a 14 percentage point gap between or in support for Trump amongst young men in 2024. I think that their health and wellness comes up as a top issue for young people across the board, but increasingly so for young men. When I ask, what are your hobbies? What do you like to do? It most often has to do with going to the gym or some form of exercise or cooking and clean eating. And the Maha movement has made gains because of that. But health is not something that is inherently political, and Democrats have a massive opportunity to re-engage young men by looking specifically at that trend in particular. And then, of course, Steve, your data a few weeks ago was incredible on the gender gap in terms of how young men and young women are prioritizing traditional milestones and roles in their lives. If you didn't see it, this NBC data showed, and Steve can explain this better than I can, but that young men who voted for Trump in the 2024 election said that having kids was their top measure of life success, whereas young women who voted for Harris ranked it as the last priority for their success. And so this is something that I'm talking to young people about every single day, and they see it in their own lives. But the reality is that young men and young women do not want to hate each other. They do not want to exist on two sides of the ideological spectrum. There just aren't really opportunities for them to engage together and to listen. So these are the future forward themes that I'm paying attention to.
All right. And thanks for the plug. Armin.
I think for me, it's generally how do the parties respond to the issues of the future and like where the parties are going. Because, until Donald Trump came along, and it's only started to change, both the Democrats and the Republican parties have, kind of been running on the same, aesthetic and ideological frameworks that have been in place since the late 80s, early 90s, right? Reagan era, Bush era for the Republicans, and then, Clinton, because he was the only Democrat that won 2 terms between, FDR, Truman, and Obama. Right? And nowadays, right, the Republican coalition is the most working class Republican coalition that's been assembled, in decades, probably, realistically since in the existence of the party. And, it's still primarily a party that's led by and for the interests of, bigger businesses and, people who are, holders of capital, if you want to, talk about it that way. But obviously, as you bring in more people who have different views, right? Many, new Trump voters are former Democrats who, while they might be socially or culturally conservative, they still might have more populist or liberal views on economics. And you're seeing this play out somewhat with, J.D. Vance and, Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley as well with, some of the more, you could call it populist or socialist even possibly, the different economic policies that they're doing. And, how the parties reorient themselves, in response to one another doing that, particularly on the issue of trade as well, right? Where the Republicans are now all of a sudden realizing that tariffs are good for Liberation Day, right? And Democrats are finding their free trade, historical basis. So that's the first one, right? It's just where do the parties go, right? Perhaps on issues that aren't as polarized yet, like AI, right? So at Split Ticket, the argument, we did a poll, actually, we're coming out with that soon. Maybe it's come out. I haven't, I've been busy. I haven't seen. But the argument, we have a poll about AI specifically and, how different subgroups of people think about AI just as an issue. And so that's one thing. And then the other is just, how do voters that are entering the political process, whether that's young voters or, new Latino voters or new Asian voters or immigrant voters, these people whose, place in the American political system hasn't fully crystallized yet, how do those people actually look at issues and, where do they place themselves and, are there different correlations as to why they place themselves that way?
I guess I'll return a little bit to what I was saying a little bit before, media consumption. I think both in trends, watching both from the media end and kind of from the politics end of it. I think from the media angle, very interested to continue watching, the continued kind of dance between independent and mainstream media, seeing as that evolves. We're seeing just, in the next few weeks expected, that Paramount, CBS will be acquiring Barry Weiss's, the Free Press from Substack. I think you see, if you go to the New York Times website now, you see those kind of vertical videos, Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, very TikTok-style videos on the New York Times homepage. I think you're seeing kind of mainstream media learning the lessons of independent media and vice versa. And I think particularly trying to find ways to, come across more authentic and more personable, more kind of speaking to audiences that I think are kind of have not been very satisfied with kind of like the voice of God approach that I think, those kind of outlets have historically used. So I'm interested to see those kinds of, kind of meshing kind of continue. I think from the political angle too, I think a lot of politicians, and I think probably 2024 is probably the end of this, but are still very used to a very old media kind of way of mind. And the reality is that, if you look at, there was a Pew study just out yesterday that kind of looked at media consumption by age and showed people 65 plus 3% regularly get their news from TikTok, and obviously 65 plus, that's not a small amount of politicians and our major politicians right now, and for 18 to 29-year-olds it's 43%, and so this huge kind of gulf, and as was talked about earlier, not a lot of politicians are in that 18-29 cohort. I don't think are as kind of fluent in that kind of way of reaching voters. And then on the other end, if you look at I think the major cable networks where a lot of politicians still kind of go and they expect to be able to get their message across. Then according to Nielsen, if you look at CNN, Fox, MSNBC, the median ages, I think respectively it's 67, 69, and 70 of their viewerships, which means effectively as many people watching any of those cable networks are in their 70s or 80s as are in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s combined. And so I think it's just hugely different ways of consuming information, and I think you're seeing politicians slowly starting to adapt to reaching voters that way. Obviously, we saw Donald Trump use this kind of new media ecosystem to great effect in the 2024 election. But as has been noted elsewhere, a lot of those kind of major influencers and podcasters that he really, kind of gave time to and gave time to him in 2024 are not been as satisfied with his administration thus far. I mean, you've seen Joe Rogan is the most famous example, has criticized Trump, obviously on the Epstein files, on inflation just recently, has been critical of the administration, in a few different facets, on the free speech, issues. That was also a huge animating issue, I would say, for a lot of young men in this last election who feel very censored, very kind of quieted by the establishment. And now you see, at least, the Trump administration flirting with doing that themselves, and immediately got blowback from a lot of those kind of podcast influencers. I don't think that means, I think sometimes it's portrayed in a way like Joe Rogan is criticizing Trump and now all the young men that listen to him also won't like that thing because they just listen to Joe Rogan, whatever he says. That's not what I'm saying. I think, but he is, I think, not a bad, vessel and representation of what a lot of very disaffected young people who don't really align with either party and don't really, certainly don't get media through traditional lens and very skeptical of institutions. He's a good approximation for where those views are. And I think, you see that there was kind of a very clear marriage of that in 2024, where there was like a real alignment of those interests. And more, I think you're seeing that split apart. And so I'll be interested to see how that manifests itself, in 2025 and then the 2026 midterms.
Let me just channel my bosses for a second. The average age of our viewers is 70, but it's a young 70. So.
Of course.
All right, well, this was great. Really appreciate it, guys. How about a hand here? The future political analyst.